Okay, this is Unit 4A, Part 2. We'll now start talking about the individual glands in the endocrine system and their nature and their products and how they regulate each other. First organ that or gland that we'll talk about is the pituitary gland. It's a gland which has two lobes, a posterior lobe and a anterior lobe, and it is in fact made up of neural tissue which extends down from the hypothalamus down through a connecting stalk of tissue called the infundibulum. So this organ is in fact hanging down, the pituitary gland is hanging down from the hypothalamus, attached via this infundibulum, and it's all an extension of neural tissue that goes down into the posterior lobe. Now the posterior lobe receives two hormones from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is where those hormones are made, but it will receive them and it stores them and then will secrete them when necessary. In contrast, and by the way, another name for the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is the neurohypophysis. On the other side, the anterior lobe, what you have is glandular tissue which itself can synthesize and secrete a number of hormones. And it's called an alternate name for it is called the adenohypophysis. Adeno refers to secretory type of glandular tissue. And neuro, of course, in the posterior lobe refers to neural tissue. So we have the neurohypophysis and the adenohypophysis. The difference being that this one, receives and stores and when necessary secretes two hormones, and the anterior one receives signals, definitely hormonal signals. It receives hormonal signals through the bloodstream from the hypothalamus, but then responds to those signals by starting to synthesize and secrete other hormones. And here you see a diagram showing up here in this area here, that's the hypothalamus up here, and then there's this stalk or infundibulum, and then here you have the pituitary gland that's divided into two lobes. On this side in this diagram, on the left side there's the posterior lobe, and on the right side is the anterior lobe. And you can see for the posterior lobe the neural tissue extending downwards from the hypothalamus into this infundibulum. I'll do it in a different color. So it's coming down, and these axons, neural tissue axons, are coming down into the posterior lobe, and they're bringing with them, exporting from the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe, these two hormones. The two hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, ADH. On the other side, you have the anterior lobe, which itself does get signals, hormonal signals coming out of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus can produce hormones that go into the bloodstream and then come down to the anterior lobe, and that will trigger synthesis of these hormones from the anterior lobe. Let me just remove all of this stuff. So what we have, in fact, is a situation where the hypothalamus is very important, and the pituitary gland is also, and it has two areas that have quite different functions. In this diagram, please note that it's flipped around in terms of the lobes. Now the anterior lobe is on the left side and the posterior lobe is on the right. And you can see these extensions of neural tissue down into the posterior lobe, triggering exporting down two hormones, oxytocin, and an old name for ADH is vasopressin, but we will use ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and they get exported down and stored here and released when needed. Whereas the anterior lobe, it can synthesize and release ACTH, growth hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and prolactin. All those are important enzymes that have important effects on other tissues. Not enzymes, hormones that have important effects on other tissues. So this relationship is quite important, the pituitary hypothalamic relationship. As far as the posterior lobe is concerned, it's really a downgrowth or extension of hypothalamic neural tissue. That neural tissue extends down through the infundibulum and exports these two hormones down into the posterior lobe, down the infundibulum. On the other side, in the anterior lobe, you have the no direct tissue contact, but you do have a vascular connection called the hypophyseal portal system, which carries hormones from the hypothalamus down into the anterior lobe and can trigger synthesis in the anterior lobe of several different hormones. The hypophyseal portal system is made up of a number of different tissues, but I wouldn't worry about learning these names here. So here we have again the same diagram, and each of these hormones has particular effects on target tissues. Oxytocin has effects on the uterus and the breast. Antidiuretic hormone, as you know, has effects on the kidneys. Adrenal corticotropic hormone, or ACTH, has an effect on the cortex of the adrenal glands. Growth hormone will have effect on the liver, and follicle stimulating hormone will have effects on the gonads in the male and the female, just as luteinizing hormone also has effects on the female and male gonads. Thyroid stimulating hormone has effects on the thyroid gland, and prolactin has an effect on the breast for lactation. So the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, or the adenohypophysis, produces these 6 hormones, as I listed before, and these regulate the activity of other endocrine glands or tissue in the body. But there is also a 7th hormone that it produces called POMC. Now, POMC itself is a large molecule which can be split by enzyme activity into ACTH, so that's where this ACTH comes from, but also the other parts of the molecule become opiates and melanocyte stimulating hormone. But it's good enough for you to know these 6 and that there is a 7th called POMC. The anterior lobe of the pituitary is under the influence of hormones coming from the hypothalamus, and they stimulate the anterior lobe of the pituitary to either release or they inhibit the release of different hormones. So you have, for many of these hormones, you have releasing hormones coming from the hypothalamus, which stimulate synthesis and release of particular hormones, or you have inhibiting hormones that shut it off. And for each of the different hormones, pretty much, you have a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone, which is produced in the hypothalamus, released into the bloodstream, and acts on the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Growth hormone, one of these hormones produced by the anterior lobe, is under this kind of influence. So it's controlled by growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So if the hypothalamus is releasing growth hormone releasing hormone, then that will stimulate the anterior lobe to produce and release growth hormone. And if it's releasing more growth hormone inhibiting hormone, then that will inhibit production and release of growth hormone. This hormone, growth hormone, is produced in the anterior lobe, and it can act on most of the cells in the body, but it particularly targets the bone and skeletal muscle, and it helps promote protein synthesis and also increase metabolism of fats for fuel. So it acts on the cells, and then there's responses which cause stimulation of growth, particularly bone and skeletal muscle. It has essentially insulin-like, it acts on the cells to produce a factor called insulin-like growth factor. So this tissue will grow more. It has quite a few different metabolic effects, but essentially it's acting as a stimulator of growth. Now here you see a diagram showing a flow chart of the effects of growth hormone. So when the hypothalamus is releasing growth hormone, releasing hormone, then the anterior lobe will start producing that growth hormone, which has effects on liver tissue and also fat tissue, and in general causes growth of muscle and bone, skeletal growth, and protein synthesis, cell growth in the muscles particularly, and has other metabolic effects. With release of increasing amounts of growth hormone, there is a negative feedback that will cause inhibition of growth hormone releasing hormone, and so an inhibition of growth hormone synthesis and release. It's under a negative feedback control system. Of the 7 hormones that are produced in the anterior lobe, there are 4 which are considered to be tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that regulate secretion of hormones by other endocrine glands. So the tropic hormones produced in the anterior lobe include thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, adrenocorticotropic, which acts on the thyroid gland, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which acts on the cortex of the adrenals, follicle stimulating hormone, which acts on the gonads, and luteinizing hormone, which also acts on the gonads in males and females. Thyroid stimulating hormone, as I said, a tropic hormone, stimulates the normal development of the thyroid, secretory activity of the thyroid. It has a releasing hormone that acts coming from the hypothalamus that can act on the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And if the hormone levels rise, if the hormone levels of thyroid hormone rise, then that gives a negative feedback and inhibits TSH. Similarly, ACTH is a tropic hormone, And it will stimulate, as I said, the adrenal cortex, the cortical part of the adrenal glands, the outer part of the adrenal glands, and stimulate them to release corticosteroids. And again, it's under the influence of a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus called CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. And there's a number of things that can trigger release. Stress, fever, low blood sugar can trigger release of CRH, which causes, of course, release of ACTH. The other two tropic hormones are follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. We'll talk about these a lot more when we talk about reproduction and pregnancy, but they regulate the activity of the ovaries and the testes. Follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate gamete production, eggs in females and sperm in males. It is absent in young boys and girls who have not gone through puberty yet, so you won't find follicle stimulating hormone in a prepubertal child. And again, it's under the control of the hypothalamus, and the releasing hormone is called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And this hypothalamic release of gonadotropin releasing hormone will occur during and after puberty. These gonadotropins, LH and FSH, in females, the luteinizing, or LH, works together with FSH to trigger maturation of an ovarian follicle. An ovarian follicle is a round fluid-filled structure that contains an egg which is ready to be released. Actual release or expulsion of the egg is triggered by luteinizing hormone. So that's the mechanism of ovulation. Luteinizing hormone will cause expulsion or trigger expulsion of the egg out of the follicle in the ovary. And luteinizing hormone also promotes synthesis and release of these two important steroid hormones in the female, estrogen and progesterone. In the male, luteinizing hormone stimulates cells in the testes that produce testosterone. And so it has a different name. I wouldn't worry about that too much. But there are these specialized cells in the testes, and we'll see them when we do reproductive organs, when we look at reproduction. Luteinizing hormone acts on these cells and to trigger testosterone production. So the sixth and last hormone that I'll talk about, coming from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, is called prolactin, and in females it will stimulate milk production. It is under the control of the two hypothalamic hormones, a releasing hormone and a inhibiting hormone. So it has a regulation, like some of the others, of hypothalamic hormones that can trigger release or can inhibit release. Typically, the blood level of prolactin will rise towards the end of pregnancy, helping to prepare the breasts for milk production. One of the signals that stimulates prolactin releasing hormone is suckling of the infant. So right at the start, when the baby's born and first starts to nurse and suckle on the nipple, it will trigger more PRH release from the hypothalamus, which then triggers prolactin release and therefore encourages continued milk production. As long as the baby continues to nurse, there will be continual milk production by the mother. And that's the end of Unit 4A, Part 2.